Excited to introduce Joe Carver, who is our Chief Innovation Officer, who joined the Meadows in January. And he has done talks all across the country for national audiences, and most recently, just last week with Courtney Friedman at the Atlas Conference. So Joe's here to talk about technology today and raising this next generation of digital citizens. So Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. I hope that everyone can hear me. And in the event that you cannot hear me or we experience some disruption, just give me a nod in the chat and I can always adjust. I've got backup headphones and all sorts of things with me just so that we can make sure we're all connected together this morning. As Ms. Kennedy said, I came to this path in a sort of non-traditional way. I'm not your traditional tech person, actually. I started my career in argumentation. I taught argumentation, interpersonal communication, cultural communication at the collegiate level. And it was around 2000, 2001 when I started to see the strong perceivable shift in the way that technology affected all of those things. And I became, I don't know that obsessed is the right word. We tend to overuse that these days. I mean, my 6-year-old refers to being obsessed with everything. But I would say that it definitely became a passion. And it led me to a period of years as the director of technology at Carrollton School of the Sacred Heart, which is when I started giving a lot of these conversations with parents and with various assorted communities. So today, I'm going to share a slide with you in a minute, and we're going to walk through a few things together. And then at the end of that, I'm hopeful that I'll be able to take any and all questions you might have. So just give me 1 second as I shift over to presentation mode. We should be all set. So I refer to this conversation as a sort of anti-technology talk. And the reason for that is because I've seen probably 100 of these in my lifetime. And I was just telling Ms. Kennedy what I find so frustrating about them. And you can search the web after we're done and find some of your own, but they're invariably these sort of time capsules. So you'll find someone who's paid an exorbitant amount of money giving you advice on how to keep your child from misusing Facebook, which is a tool that your child at this point is probably well past in their interest level. And so instead of really addressing the core issues of developing a framework for how to deal with technology, they deal with the tools. So I consider this sort of the anti-technology talk because we do the opposite of that in this conversation. I'd like to start by setting a couple of goals with you for today's conversation. The first goal is to create a shared language about what we mean when we talk about technology. And I don't mean for us to spend a lot of time digging into how it works or the minutia of networking or privacy or security, but rather just to be a bit more specific about the things that we are talking about. Because when we have a pronounced and effective shared language, we can set expectations, not just for our children, but for our families, for our educators, our teachers, all of those things. So perfect example. I have a 9-year-old son. His name is Jonah. My wife and I came to an agreement a long time ago that Jonah could not watch violent movies. Since that time, my wife and I have come to understand that we do not entirely agree on what constitutes a violent movie. It's a lot to expect a babysitter or a teacher or someone else without any shared language about that to agree with me about what a violent movie is. The same is true of our technology. If we're not clear about what we mean when we say you can't do X, then our teachers, our babysitters, our older siblings, our extended family, they can't help us to set those guidelines for our children. So the first and most important part of this process is really to develop a language and to make sure that that language evolves along with our children. The second part of today's conversation is to start to provide a framework. And that framework is really about the questions that we should be asking before we give our child a new device. And I'm envisioning, though I can't see many faces right now, that a certain amount of panic set in at that moment, because there are a lot of parents right now saying, but I've already given my child the device. What are these questions and what do I do now? And we'll talk about that. But I do think that perhaps one of the more significant things that we can do for our children when it comes to technology is to have a framework that's built around our value system. our family shared value system, to say, these are the sort of conditions that need to be met before we bring something into our home. And if you think about it, we do that with just about everything else in our lives. Before we add a sibling or a pet or a new friend to the family, we have this sort of unspoken framework that says, is this going to fit? Is this align with our values? Is this going to advance what we're trying to do for our children? But with technology, too often that decision gets made in a vacuum and rushed, and we don't put it through the paces of saying, is this really part of our family's plan before it ends up in the hands of a child? And then, of course, we're surprised when it doesn't. So today's goal, is in many ways to set that framework. And I will provide you a framework, because the likelihood is that for every person that's in here, there's a whole different set of values. We might have some overlap, and we might have some that doesn't. But if we have the key sort of rubric for, these are the things I need to ask myself, I think it puts us in a better position for success. And then the last part of the conversation will be the only part where I'll really try to persuade you today. And that is to really get you to embrace the responsibility of being a lifelong learner as far as technology goes. Being a lifelong learner in technology doesn't mean spending every day reading TechCrunch or investing in tech companies, but it does mean that when you start to download an application that says, is the user over 13 years old, that you read and say, let's find out if this person, am I really giving this to someone who's over 13? Or before you install an update, you read and say, let me determine what they're going to do with the data they're collecting in this application, so that you can have conversations. The beautiful thing about this is every single one of you that's on this talk, my guess is, has someone in your home that can teach you about technology. And yes, they're probably 5 to 8 years old, but chances are that they've learned and learn to navigate through this world so effectively that they will be excellent teachers, and you should embrace that role as student. So at the end of this conversation, I'm sort of hopeful that we're all on the same page with that. All right, so differentiating between technology, and I hope you'll bear with me, because I imagine there's some sophisticated folks on here that think that this might not be the most useful 5 minutes. I'm hopeful that you'll trust me with it. As I said before, the more specific we are with our conversations with our children, the more accurate our expectations can be with what they use. So being able to differentiate between things like hardware and software, ecosystems, and the internet, these are things that benefit us. So let's start with hardware. When I was your child's age, the first computer entered into our home. And if I remember correctly, it was a Commodore 64. I could be wrong. It's been a long, long time. What that Commodore 64 could do was limited to the processing power that came inside that little plastic shell that it was built on. So I spent 8 to 10 hours programming it. And at the end of the day, I had a hot air balloon that would bounce across the screen. So I spent my day programming, working out the various kinks, recognizing the mistakes I made, until at the end of the day, I had this product, which was a green hot air balloon bouncing across the screen. And at the time, it seemed like an incredible reward. My parents left us there for innumerable hours to do that. And they could do that because the only thing that that box could do was what was inside the machine. It couldn't connect. It didn't have networking capabilities. We weren't going to reach out to the outside world. We were limited to whatever that processing power of the Commodore 64 was. That's changed. But even in a world absent the internet, here's a statistic for you to keep in mind. Hardware computing power has increased since my childhood by a factor of 1 trillion. That's with a T, in case my connection all the way from Florida isn't clear enough, by 1 trillion. So imagine this. Most of you at this point have probably bought your child their first bicycle, and you came home with it. It had training wheels on it. You took your child into the yard or to the street. You got them out and you start working on them, developing the skills to balance a bike. Now, instead of that bike, what I'd like you to envision is in that first session on that bicycle, that over the course of that first day of learning, the training wheels came off, a combustible motor was installed, and by the end of that day, it could travel 170 miles an hour. Because that's basically the speed at which computing power on local devices has evolved in our lifetimes. It's remarkable what they can do. And that's separate and apart from anything that happens from networking. That's just what you bring home. I've heard, and I have never validated, that the processing power in our phones is more than was needed to reach the moon the first time. So it gives you an idea of, when you bring a device into your home, what sort of power you're handing off. And that's in a vacuum. What we're going to talk about next is that ecosystem and the network and what that means. But it's important to note that the very first computer that you buy for your child will likely have more processing power than NASA had at its disposal in the 60s. An ecosystem or software is often an afterthought, but I think it's really important to talk to parents about it, because a lot of our decision making comes down to what works with what we already have, and that's the ecosystem. Some companies were way ahead in this sense, right? Apple, for example, knew full and well when it launched its iTunes store that it was going to make it a little bit difficult for you to use anything you purchased outside of that ecosystem. They knew that as their product lines grew, that as you expanded your purchasing, you would be more likely to stay inside that ecosystem because you already had content in that ecosystem. So lots of us, when we decide to buy the first phone or tablet for our child, one of the first things we think about is, how familiar is it to me? And how does it work with what I already have in my home? The good thing about that is that lots of companies that have given serious consideration to their ecosystem have given just as much consideration into how to operate in a family. Again, in this case, I'll use Apple. Apple has relatively sophisticated native capabilities to manage their devices inside your home, which is to say, you can set up a family plan on Apple and say, I will only allow my child to have access to these apps after I've confirmed their ability. You can set it up so that you can shut off the internet. So each of these ecosystems has a different strength and a different weakness. It's really important to get familiar with one. And if you're saying to yourself, I'm not really sure what ecosystem we have in our family right now, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. That means that you're likely not in so deep to a particular brand and ecosystem that you can't step back and say, well, let me think about what the priorities are for me. In some homes, the ecosystem is actually less about the operating system and more about what you use for your broadband. So in other words, some of you may say, oh, we've got Chromebooks in our house, and we have iPads in our house, and we have Chrome Stick and Apple TV, and I have a Mac, and my wife uses a PC, but we try to manage using some sort of, Cox's internet capabilities and their programs that are designed for managing them. That's part of your ecosystem too. But if you have devices spread all over your house and you're not really sure how you're managing them, other than when somebody comes to you and hands you something and says, can you put your password in this so that I can use it? Then without me passing judgment, I'm saying, I think you need to have more control over that ecosystem, okay? The third category is the one that spooks everybody, and that's the internet. So as I said at the very beginning, we were formerly limited by the power that came in the box with the computer that we bought. But that changed with the accessibility to the internet. And then it really changed, quite frankly, when there was a strategy by one of these ecosystems to just push you out to the internet. And if you're not familiar with what I mean by that, I mean the Chromebook. The Chromebook, by design, was intended to say, you don't need anything local. Nothing that you're using inside your house is important. Let's get you out into the World Wide Web where you can harness the power of the internet. And that's a great thing for so many reasons. And we could have a whole nother conversation about what that is. But the bottom line is, it allowed us to harness the processing power of the entire internet, as opposed to being limited to what's in that box. So my Commodore 64 is no longer the most important part of my world. It's just a portal to a whole nother world of processing power and digital power that I could never afford for home use. So it's remarkable in that sense. But it's also important to acknowledge that it was a market. It was a marketing tool. It was designed to reduce the cost of entry and to put you into an ecosystem. So the Chromebook is a product of Google, which is a fantastic, amazing company that's got all sorts of advantages and all sorts of disadvantages. But there can be little doubt that the design was create inexpensive hardware that essentially slid you right into their ecosystem. And that ecosystem and your use of it guaranteed that you would be there for a relatively long time. I think that we will probably spend a good part of the rest of this talk today talking about the internet. But I do think it's important to recognize the hardware ecosystem and software pieces that also affect your children. I don't know how many of you have seen the film, The Social Dilemma. It can be a bit startling, even for, I think, people who are really informed about what they're doing. But there's a quote in it that I just displayed. If you didn't pay for the product, then you are the product. And they said it in the film, The Social Dilemma. They were a little bit off. The way that they use it in the film, I don't think is actually quite accurate. The way that they're describing it basically is that when you get free games via the internet, that essentially nothing is free because you're being bombarded with advertising. And that's how these companies have subsidized these games. So the reference in the film is more about the sort of advertising monetization model of the internet. But we're well past the advertising monetization aspect of the internet. Years and years ago, someone figured out that there was a more effective way, and that was to leverage the data that could be collected by virtue of the time that we spend on the internet. And again, there's another dramatic misconception, is that the companies out on the internet are selling our data. And I think that I don't want to spend a lot of time going into the minutia of this argument because it's detailed so well in The Social Dilemma. It's one of the things that they do very well in that film. But the bottom line is there's not really an incentive to sell our data. That's the thing that those companies have. What they'd like to do is develop the most specific profile of their users that they can, so that they can affect the most subtle change in our behaviors and then market that change to the companies that buy from them. So it's not the same thing as saying, oh, I can sell you all the information about what Joe Carver does when he's playing this RPG online. It's much more about saying, this is what it takes to keep Joe Carver's attention online. This is how long you can expect him to be there. This is what we need to change if we want to extend that time. And that is way more valuable than just the blast of some sort of arbitrary piece of advertising on the screen. Nonetheless, when we're talking about the games that we put on our children's devices, or the games that they go out to play, or the apps that we install on them, even though it's a little bit simplistic, it is a magnificent rule of thumb to keep in mind. The statement, if you didn't pay for the product, somewhere along the line, you probably are becoming the product. So our children now use their devices, their phones, their tablets, their Chromebooks, their laptops, their televisions, their smart TVs, their watches, all of these tools to get to the internet. It's the vast majority of the time they spend. It's almost unheard of now for someone to go to a store, buy a software piece for a video game that installs on their computer and plays without connecting to some network online so that they can play with other folks. So really, even though the Chromebook was singular in its launch, all of our devices are doing almost the same thing for children in our children's age group, specifically those who are in elementary and upper school education. They use these devices to get to the web. So I know that Ms. Kennedy said that we were going to be dealing with kindergartners to second graders, parents today primarily. So try to find what the typical usage of your children on the internet is. The average time for children age 5 to 10, and I understand that that's a little bit on the high end for you, is 4 hours and 44 minutes a day. So a lot of people, when they hear that statistic, the first thing they say is, well, that's great. We don't spend nearly that. But let's take account of what we're really talking about. Because what is it that they are when they're on the internet? It's not just when they're on one of these apps. It could be when they're watching network television. It could be any number of things. So let's look at the primary uses and just take a minute or two to go through them. Again, some of these you may be incredibly familiar with, but I consider this the first in a series of conversations that we're going to have. And so developing a shared language about what these things are is one of the most important goals for me. Obviously, lots of children spend time gaming online now, whether they're playing Minecraft or Fortnite or Legos. Those are all network, internet-based games that are wildly popular. Children use the internet to chat, instant message, WhatsApp, Clubhouse, Discord. These last two, if you're not familiar with them, if you haven't heard of them, we're going to circle back to them because this is where social media is going right now. Clubhouse and Discord are probably the most significant social media tools and will be over the next year or two. And they present an interesting sort of dilemma for parents. So we'll come back to those. I also think it's really important that you consider audio video consumption to be part of their online time, whether they're watching YouTube videos, whether it's creating content for TikTok or just watching content for TikTok. It's always startling to tell a 9 or 10-year-old about what TikTok is and how it's owned, who owns it. It's Chinese companies, largely owned by the Chinese government. They're always startled by that and wonder what China would have, what interest China might have in the video that they're making. But they are mostly astonished when they are told that the video content has absolutely nothing to do with the mission purpose of TikTok. It is literally just to distract you and to continue to use it so that it can continue to fine tune that sort of growth hack of what your profile is and data collection. So the TikTok video creation aspect is really a Trojan horse for what it's intended to be used for. Social media is obviously the boogeyman for all of us now. And I think that some of these talks, as well as the film Social Dilemma and things that came after it, have done a great deal to sort of articulate what's so dangerous about social media. If it starts with even the most basics, which are that anybody can get on and pretend that they're anybody else, that in and of itself is frightening. But when we look at what these companies have essentially evolved into, which is really to say that they are without ownership, in the sense that once they are out in the world, very few people can, short of taking them offline, control them. They're literally sort of the living, breathing example of war games, or how this sort of technology that, when unleashed on the world, can be used for tremendous good, but also can be used for tremendous bad, and that the people who developed it don't have the ability to steer that. So it's really about the way users end up using it, and becomes sort of a frightening exercise. And then subscription services, which I think really sort of lag behind some of these other things, but Apple Arcade, those kinds of things that kids use. I think that what we see for the youngest children in these cases are when dad or mom has a meeting and they need 20 minutes of relative silence, and they're willing to hand off their phone so that they can get that 20 minutes of silence, which is an entirely forgivable mistake, but it is in most instances a mistake. That's when you see most of the subscription service use. Kids who have their own devices and get to spend time on them, this isn't the first place that they stop. So I'd like to slip back up to Clubhouse and Discord. And again, I'm not sure how familiar you are with these things. Discord started as an audio feed that was designed to accompany your children's video games. So when your kids play online video games, whether they're Call of Duty or some other fantasy-based game that is a network game, they're able to audio chat with their friends. And the way that they're able to do that was through Discord. Discord gave them an ability to basically have instant messaging that was audio in real time. It compressed the audio, made it deliverable across the web, gave it very high quality, and so it became a dominant tool for communicating in these games. There's a recurring theme in all of these games with this video chat, and that is our audio chat, excuse me. And that is that these conversations devolve into some of the nastiest places on the internet. So the conversations that happen when your kids are in a game that you thought, oh, they're playing a Lego game that also networks with other kids that are playing and building worlds, or Minecraft, those things, the Discord channel that happens in association with that is some of the darkest and most unforgivable parts of the internet that I see. Because there is no regulation inside there. And there is very little limitation to stop someone who isn't interested in playing that game from entering. So you'll hear a lot of student abuse cases, meaning, where a child's been exposed to terrible language or called names or cyberbullied. So much of it happens in these audio chat apps now. That's like the location for it. So in addition to Discord is Clubhouse, which is less tethered to the game community and more just like a gathering place. So it is, you could join Clubhouse and say, I want to be a part of the, Western United States Minecraft Club's chat room. And it basically allows you to interact in audio format in real time with anyone else that's inside of them in a relatively unregulated manner. So Are there Clubhouse channels and Discord channels for children? Absolutely. Are your children secure in those? I would never, ever describe it as that. I think that every attempt that's made to make those places safer just sort of is a game of whack-a-mole and drives behaviors in different places. So those are the current future of social media, are these sort of audio chat apps. Kids are looking for them for entirely innocent reasons because they can talk to their friends and it's like being on the phone and it's in real time while they play games together. And then just at the exact same time are people that are looking for the opportunity to exploit those resources and use them for purposes that are not what you would want for your children. I think that the convergence that is dangerous for those two communities is the one thing that they all really do prefer is to not have a history of what happens. And so it's a child's natural inclination to want autonomy and to want privacy. I want to talk to my friends and not have my parents listening to every word. Well, as these apps seek to do that in a virtual environment, it's also what creates the sort of risk in them. And so this is one of those places where both are positive end users and those who want to use it negatively, their interests converge and it becomes more dangerous. So often seeking out that element of privacy with their friends, they often find privacy with folks that they didn't intend to have it with. So that's the way they're using it. Those are the 4 hours and 44 minutes a day, which, by the way, just so that you don't feel totally alarmed, that also includes time in school. So, when your students are spending times on the devices that are in school, and I'm hopeful actually that Ms. Kennedy will invite me back at some point and that I can talk to you about specifically with Ms. Friedman about the way that we use devices in school so that you have the language for that and feel comfortable. But there's a lot of devices out there. They've been handed out without necessarily all of the thought into why we're doing it. And so I'd like to take a minute to talk about what the questions that I really think that you need to ask. And if you'll indulge me, I'm going to, again, reference back to my childhood. I grew up in a little tiny town in Northern California called Forestville. Last time I lived there, they did the census. Population was 1,776 citizens. So you can't get much more American than that, than having your population be 1776. But every year or two, we might get a new student in school. And when we got a new student, if that student became a friend of one of my siblings or myself, then there was this sort of natural vetting process that went through to make sure that that child's family's values aligned with the values that my family had before we were allowed to get on our bicycles and ride to the youth park and spend the afternoon together. I think that from the top level of these questions, you should consider your child's device a new friend every single day. Your child is coming home with a new friend every day because that device can change so quickly. Let me give you an example. I used to work for Apple, and one of the launch points for the iPod Touch was to provide children with a tool that wasn't a phone, but could still operate in the Apple ecosystem. Thousands and thousands of parents flooded Apple stores and said, I can buy my child for $179, something that looks like a phone, it feels like a phone, it's got all the apps that the Apple ecosystem has on it, so it can iTunes and listen to music and do all those things, but it can't text, it can't FaceTime, and it can't make phone calls. Until it could, because Apple launched an iOS update, which added all of that functionality to the device. And I'm not saying that that was done as some sort of, back-end way to make it sure that your kid's FaceTimed. It was the natural evolution of the device. The operating system had the capacity to do these things. There's a room full of engineers who are sitting around thinking, well, what can we do to make this device more useful? And the next thing you know, they pushed an update to your device that allows it to do exactly what you had intended to avoid. And odds are most parents logged in, hit update, and moved on without even being aware of the change and what happened with this device. It fundamentally changed the architecture of the device that had been given to children. And most parents probably didn't notice it at first. So when I say it's a new friend every day, I mean that updates and applications can change the way your device functions on a dime. And so if you're not literally updating your profile about what that device is more frequently than you're updating its profile, then you're losing touch with what your child can do. So the big question, to what end am I giving this device to my child? Every family has a different value system. Every family has different challenges. And I wouldn't deem myself the person to say yes or no, but you should be asking your question. Because if the answer to this question is one that you're embarrassed about, if it's something like, well, everybody else has one, or I'm tired of saying no, that might not be a sufficient answer to add a device to your family. The second question that I think is critical, perhaps at the end of the day, it might be more critical. How does this device get managed? And what do I mean by that? I don't mean who's going to go and get the device and take it and put it in their room so that the child can't use it. I mean, how does it get managed from the end of who makes the decisions of what apps get installed on it? Who makes decisions of what networks it can connect to? Who's going to be responsible for checking to make sure that those rules are being enforced? And which ecosystem do I trust that when it tells me this doesn't belong in the hands of someone under 13 years old, that I'm going to accept and say, okay, well, then that doesn't belong in my child's hand. Don't bring a device into your home without knowing exactly how you're going to manage it. Because I guarantee you that there are 8-year-olds all over America who will figure out exactly how to manage it. And while I think it's amazing that we have kids with that capability, it's critical that they not be put in a position to make decisions that exceed their maturity. And that's what this does. So don't bring a device into the home unless you've already made a decision about how it's going to be managed from an ecosystem level, from a password protection level, from a network level. Third, what limitations are we going to impose on its use? This one's a flexible question. It's going to change all the time. It's going to literally change monthly. You might say, I'm never going to allow my child to do X, and your child's going to come home and say, okay, this is the reason I need you to give me access to Y. And you know what? If it happens, then the rule worked, because this is not intended to create some guardrail for you that will let you sleep at night and feel comfortable knowing that nothing bad can happen with a device. It's actually intended to create conversations. You and your child need to have a conversation where they have to be able to clearly articulate, this is what I'm using it for, and this is why. Why is that? Well, first, because we want you to make informed decisions about what they use. But secondly, we are creating a framework for our children to ask themselves that question when they're put in a position of power. I'm not just going to download something that's free. I'm not just going to install this. I'm not just going to update. I'm going to read it and say, oh, wait a minute, what am I giving up when I do this? Why does it matter? And that's important. So you're modeling that for a future sophisticated, mature user by saying, let's sit down and have this conversation. Instead of just creating a hard line that says, these are the limitations and that's it, I encourage you to ask two questions, or rather to ask two things of your children. Show me how you, and show me how to. Those are two critical questions that you ask your children. Show me how you. So show me how you talk to Sophia on your device. How do you do that? Children love to show us that. They want to show you the tools they're using. Then they want, show me how to. Have them demonstrate to you. How do you do that when you're on the internet? How did you build this? How did you create this world in Minecraft? Those are conversations that your children are wanting to have that are going to give you more information to make informed decisions about the way that they use their devices. And I strongly encourage you to have them all the time. And then lastly, how am I going to keep up with the evolution of this device? You just heard the example I gave about the iPod Touch. Would you have caught that? If that was your child, would you have known that day, we just installed an update that allows my child to now FaceTime with anybody or to accept a call from anyone if I don't have my device configured correctly? So how do I make sure that I have that information? I tell people all the time, subscribe to one tech feed, just one. TechCrunch, whatever, Techtopia, there's millions of them, okay? And frankly, you can get by with just reading the headlines. If you read the headlines and say, oh, that's something I need to read more of, then read the articles that just pertain to you. You'll be way more informed. But at least have those headlines come to your phone so that when something dramatic happens, you'll say, hey, wait a minute, that's a tool that we use on our device. I need to know what's happening there. Wait, that's an app that my child is using. I want to know what they just found out about what that company was doing with their data. Those are the critical questions that I think that you need to ask. I know that this sounds maybe obvious, and I know that your appearance at this talk probably suggests that you know this, but I want you to know that we know it too, and that it's a focus on our side at the Meadows School. But there's literally no replacement for raising our children with a clear sense of what our family values are and connecting those values to our lives with technology. So let's isolate that last part. I'm virtually certain that our parents are doing an incredible job at instilling family values in their children. I walk around the Meadows School, and the children that I interact with on a daily basis bring me incredible joy. They're smart, engaging, and social. So let's assume that first part. How are we doing on that second part? How many conversations have we had with our children about the yeses and nos about technology being connected to what our true family values are? Because if we're not, then we can't be surprised when we raise children who live in one world with their family and a different world with their technology. Right? It's simple. We want to raise children that bring all of those values that matter to us from whatever world they're in with us to the next one that they travel into, whether it's their school space, sports space, club space, service space, technology space, right? And if we take the time to make sure that we're aligning our core values with the way that we hand out that technology, then in the end, we will be creating a generation of kids that's thoughtful and purposeful about the way that they use their technology, which at the end of the day is frankly all that we can ask, because they are going to be confronted with challenges in the use of technology that we cannot envision yet. Remember what we started with: computational power increasing over a 40-year period by a factor of 1 trillion. Imagine what 20 years from now they'll be envisioning. It's a much different scenario. So if we take the time to connect our family values to the lives they live with their technology, then at least we know that they're bringing those values to the decision-making too. I thank you for listening. I hope that I've saved you a sufficient amount of time to ask me all of the questions that you want to ask. That's the purpose of this. And I hope that we've given you some valuable direction with how to manage the introduction of technology into these little people's lives as you move forward. So I don't know how Ms. Kennedy wants to manage the questions, but hopefully somebody, either she or Courtney, can help me manage them, because I'm a bit inept at that part of the process. Courtney knows this because she deals with me all the time. So
Sure, we can go ahead, and if somebody has a question, they can unmute themselves and ask it. You could also put it in the chat, either way.
And I have stopped sharing so that I will be able to see the chat. Or feel free to just fire away. I'm here at your disposal.
Joe, while we're waiting to see if there's any questions,
Yeah.
could you just go, you had mentioned in passing, you said subscribe to a couple of tech feeds, which I thought was a great suggestion. Could you mention a couple of your favorites? I think you said TechCrunch.
Actually, TechCrunch is one that I use a lot. A lot of times I think that it's beneficial for you to use the ones that that focus on your ecosystem. So if you're a Microsoft family, finding one that's sort of driven in the Microsoft space. If you're Apple family, one in the Apple space. I also have what's called an aggregator, or an RSS feed, that I created a long time ago while I was at Carrollton. And I'm hoping to add it to the website at the Meadows School. And it essentially just creates a tech daily. And every day there's just a new feed with sort of the top 8 articles. And most of them are about the ed tech space. But if there's something big happening in the world, it's a great reference point too. So I'm hoping to add that. In the interim, if somebody's interested in seeing it, you can email me and I will happily send you the link to it. I'd appreciate people reading it. It feels like it gets lonely over there. So
Great.
Kennedy and Carver, I do have a question. This is Julie Mace. Hi.
Hi.
Oh, good. You guys can hear me. Okay, great.
Yes.
I'm not as good as this as my daughter is, of course. So
that's the story of all of us.
Right, exactly. So thank you so much for putting this together. It's amazing. This is almost a little over my realm of the whole technology stuff. I don't know all the background stuff, which is kind of why I feel like we kind of went with this. And not that this has to happen now, but I'm hoping that in the future, if we could get more meetings and even communicate with the kids on the effects of what the cell phone use is doing to families, disrupting them, their social lives, their tunnel vision into the social media world, and how it's really kind of out of control.
Yeah, if it's okay, I mean, obviously that's an entire topic on its own. There's
It
no
is.
question.
It is.
And
It is.
but I will say, I will say a couple of things. Now, number one is that I don't have any social media, and that's not accidental. I could easily spend an hour or two talking about what I think is one of the greater threats for our children. A lot of those threats really are from from the sort of a social and counseling side. And I think it's important that the people that speak about that are experts in things like self-concept and what it's doing to those kinds of, how it's changing our sort of neuroplasticity. I think it's good to have people from the counseling department have those conversations. It also tends to dovetail into things like bullying, cyberbullying, and those things. And I think it's good to have those folks on board for that too. But I will take the opportunity to say that, number one, there's not really a coherent argument for giving a child access to social media. There just simply is not enough of an advantage that's ever been articulated by even the founders of these products to outweigh what we know are the unregulated risks of those products. And so I think that the longer that you resist allowing your child to enter into the sort of social media realm, the better, quite frankly.
Oh, absolutely.
There's no downside to that delay short of peer pressure. And the second is, I really believe
that's what it is. And so many of these young kids have a TikTok, they have their YouTube, they're posting stuff on them. And it's actually, that's a little bit part of it. I don't think the parents are educated. I don't think they realize, I don't even know if some of them even know they're doing this. And then the kids, I think if they could be educated, they could be like, oh, maybe I should spend less time. I mean, they don't even realize how much time they're on it. And it has caused problems. I've seen issues with the kids getting, things happen and the parents have to get involved over social media, which means it's out there. It's too late. It's turned into a bigger war than it ever needed to be. And it's really sad and unfortunate. But so, I mean, I'd like to see some of the stuff incorporated in school and with these discussions, because it's very important. And the social media is one factor, but then the games with the kids are out of control. Like, they don't even want to go outside with their friends or see their family because they'd rather be on a game. Like, it's really sad, whether it's Roblox or whoever. It's just it's out of control. And I don't think a lot of us are educated or not aware.
So I think that, and I think everything that you've said is entirely valid. And I don't want to be self-referential, but I think that, if you go back to these cornerstone questions about the questions you need to be asking yourself before you provide a device to your child, if you go back and revisit those, because the danger is, frankly, is social media is the boogeyman right now. But social media won't be the boogeyman in a couple of years. It'll be, like you said, it'll be voice chat. It'll be online gaming. These things move on. And so the danger of sort of hyper focusing on the particular tool is that you give the risk of missing the larger question, which is that if we're not engaged and we're not aware in great detail what these devices are being used for, then there's a risk to our children that we would find it unacceptable in any other way. If your math teacher said to you, I'm going to teach your child math this year, and you said, okay, well, what are they going to learn? Don't worry about it. I'm just going to teach your child math this year. I doubt that there's anyone on this call that would find that acceptable, but we do find it acceptable when our child says, I'm going to need this app. Download this app for me. Oh, okay. What are you going to do? I'm playing a game on it. That's insufficient information to make a decision. And so I think if you go back to sort of the cornerstone questions and really ask anything that is on your child's device, if you can't answer all of these questions about it, shouldn't be on there. And it's never too late. It's never too late to restart this process. And yes, it will be painful to take them away. I have lived through it. I've taken devices away from my children and said, and I'm not talking about as a punishment. I'm not saying, Jonah, you can't use that because you spoke back. I go in and say, we made a mistake in allowing you to have access to this. I have to take it away. And this is why. And that conversation, quite frankly, might be more meaningful than the conversation that's just not even allowing. Having an adult come and say, you know what? I didn't understand that this could do this. This is why it's not acceptable. This is why I need to take it from you. Establishes, again, a rapport of like a meaningful conversation about these things. And the meaningful conversation is the starting point to a solution. The most dangerous thing you can have is a child who doesn't want to have a conversation with you about what's happening on their device. So the more these conversations take place, the better. I do. So thank you for that. And I do hope that we have more conversations, specifically with the counseling department as well, in the future about that. I see a hand up from
Ellie put her hand up first.
Okay. Oh, you're monitoring these. Great. Okay, good. Because I can't do that. Okay.
Hi, good morning. I have a first grader and a third grader, and I constantly hear from them. All my friends are on Roadblock and they're playing games, and we are the only one who doesn't have an access to your iPad. I mean, we have an iPad, but I have a password. So when I know it's the right time, I'll give it to them and they use it. So they're not in any of the gaming, with their friends or whatnot. And my older one, third grader, has her Chrome, and she cannot download any apps without my supervision. Quizlet or whatnot, what they use at school, it's the only thing she has on her Chrome. But they're constantly saying, Mommy, my friends are talking about this game and that game. We have no idea. And they're making fun of us because we don't know these games. So what are the downfalls of me not letting them to play the games? I don't know how safe they are. I don't know how addictive they are. They're very active and they go outdoor, and they're not TV people, and they're not, games or, screen kids per se. So what are the downfalls? I'm taking that away from them.
So I think it's a great question. And the one thing I would say is that, the vast majority, I get a lot of parents, and this is not directed at you specifically, but I do want to make sure that it's pronounced. I get a lot of parents who tell me, I've got a Chromebook and they're only allowed to do X, Y, and Z. And the question I always ask is, do you know what a VPN is? Because if you do not know what a VPN is, then you do not know what your child's doing on a Chromebook, because we block VPNs at the Meadows School. And I would say that probably at least a couple of times a week, new ones develop in the Chrome App Store that are browser driven, that they can access, that we find on the network and have to block. So students are very sophisticated in using virtual private networks to circumvent what they're supposed to be doing in their browser. And so being aware of that's important. It's always good to check to see what's installed in your browser, what shortcuts your child has, those kinds of things. So I say that as a caveat prior to answering your question is, be wary of feeling like, I'm in this ecosystem, I've got a handle on it. It sounds like you've got some great guardrails, and that's fantastic. But just keep in mind that the natural inclination of devices is to push their boundaries. If they weren't, then we'd still have that Commodore 64. So, you're going to have to keep up with that. Now, the question you're asking about balancing the sort of ostracization that they feel versus the risk of games is really the crux of the difficulty here. There's an inordinate amount of pressure to play games, to be able to play the games that your peers are playing, and children feel left out because of them. So what the answer to your question really lies in your family values. But what I will say to you is this: if you decide we've reached a point where this is so harmful, my daughter's feeling left out, and those sorts of things, then you set up the guardrails. You say, you know what? I understand why it's important to you to know what your friends are doing. I understand why it matters. We're going to sit together and I'm going to watch you do this. You're going to show me how it works. And I'm going to make a decision. And I'll decide whether you can continue to use it or not. And at the end of the day, I know that this isn't going to make you feel tremendously better, but the outcome of saying no is not a lifelong outcome. Okay. Our parents, yours and my parents, said no to things all of the times. And I can't really put a single piece of one of my character flaws on that. I can't say this is how I ended up because my mom wouldn't let me do X. And my parents were pretty tough. So I'm a firm believer that it's about keeping the conversation open. I think that when you reach the point where you say, you know what, my child is a sophisticated user, they understand what they're asking, we've had meaningful conversations, then you say, I'm ready to sit down with you and for you to show me how you use this. Lastly, that's not the end of the conversation, right? Because these games evolve. A lot of these games, Roblox and various games, they started as entry points, and then the chat part becomes a real risk. So I think that you have to establish what is, you're comfortable with, and say, I'm going to let you play that, but you're going to play it while I'm sitting here with you, and I'm going to be able to look and see. And if your daughter says, well, then I don't want to play it, then the issue isn't about not knowing how to play, right? It's about being able to play on their terms. And there's no other thing in our 8-year-olds' lives that we just say, well, that's how they want it. It's on their terms. She's the ice cream for dinner. She's decided that's what she wants. We would expect to say, well, these are what our values are. And I'm not going to compromise them because it's put you I'm going to raise you to feel good enough about who you are to withstand that. But I'm also not going to compromise our values in the short run, because 8 weeks from now, that game's not going to mean anything. I remember we had a rule in my family. We weren't allowed to hang posters on the wall. That gives you a sense of strictness in our family. And I had a huge argument with my father over a Mr. T poster. And my dad said to me, a year from now, you're not going to care who Mr. T is. And I cannot tell you how outrageous and uninformed that sounded to me in 1980. Wow. But turns out he was right. He knew something. And so It's the same with these games. It's the larger issue is, how do we make our kids feel included? How do we make them feel like they can be a part of a community and not give up what's inherent to their core values? And that's not the games. That's the conversations. That's the hard part. That's the raising. Right. Handing the device, that's the easy part. Right. So I think you trust your gut. You really do, and hold the line. But if you decide it's time to, put our toes in the water, then you do it together, and that it's always an opportunity to be with your children, not an opportunity to be away from them. Too often our devices are like, oh, this is my mom. No, it's mommy time. It's daddy time. That's not what that is. Mommy and daddy time can be any number of things. It can be a puzzle on the table. It can be, any number of things, but it shouldn't be with a portal out to the wide world.
Right. That was a great answer. Thank you.
Yeah, great advice. We have one more question. We have time for about one or two more questions. And I see Mr. Gicani, Ramon, is that how you pronounce your name?
That is perfect pronunciation. Thank you very much. Usually gets
better her than me.
Right. Well, thanks. It's very informative. Nice to meet you, Mr. Carver. Welcome to the team.
Nice to meet you. Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it so far with obviously the education and security and understanding the terms and understanding, the different parts of the ecosystem, whether it's hardware, networks, the software that drives it, kind of what's on the back end. This is helpful, right, for everybody. I work in the tech industry. I'm in the interactive tech industry. So
awesome.
This is something that I work on and deal with every day. And it's kind of a fine line, right? There has to be obviously security. There also has to be communication with the children and education to get them to understand. So I think this is great. I think there's some really great tools that are out there for potentially another discussion around security and trying to keep our kids safe, as well as educating our kids, right? To ask those questions too and understand before they come to us without, with an ask of an app or a game or something, that they have tried to vet and understand what's going to be asked of them if they do download something like this. My question, like I said, this part of it, and I think we can expand on these types of discussions, but I also had a question around, like technology and different tech in school, because like I said, me being from that space and dealing with it on a every second basis of my day. And when my daughter and my children, or my daughter comes in and says, Daddy, you're in, touchscreens and I want to use the iPad. And I'm like, no, you can only use it on the weekend for specific things.
Right.
It's a balance, right? So right. I was hoping also, I didn't know if there was going to be other conversations or events scheduled for more understanding about technology in the classroom too. Are you going to tackle that too? Because I'm really interested. That I live that on a daily basis, and I'm interested in potentially helping or providing additional resources and information for you and the team and the advisors for our children.
Well, I mean, we welcome obviously that conversation, and I think Ms. Kennedy will affirm that I'm readily available to have any conversations. But it also doesn't need to, it doesn't need to wait until we gather like this. You're more than welcome to reach out to me at any time. I think I'm pretty accessible. The one thing I will say is that from a nuts and bolts, we could have lots of conversation about this is what we do to protect students. This is what we do, the way we use it, purposeful use of technology in schools and all of those things. I will say that having spent the last couple of decades in education around technology, that at the end of the day, the core questions do remain the same, right? So at the Meadows School, we have a set of core values. And those core values drive the decisions that we make about the technology that we use. We never let the technology drive the values. And so everything gets filtered that way. And I have the luxury of being still an outsider in a sense, right? I've been 3 or 4 months in the community, and I've come from a school that I think had a very robust technology program. What I'm impressed about is the depth of the conversations that people are having. I'll take this moment to just sort of put a plug in for Courtney, who's on the call with us, but to have somebody in the community that is that aware of not just the tools that are being used, and I mean really like deep understanding, not just aware of the tools that are being used, but how they're being leveraged, when that falls out of what we're trying to accomplish, when the guardrails are insufficient. She's a remarkable resource. And so those conversations are ongoing, and especially in the lower school and beginning school have amazing resources. But I would welcome the opportunity to talk more about that, and also to talk with you. We are on a side note, we are also dealing with the more sort of strategic, like what are we doing to protect our network questions now, and dealing with the sort of cybersecurity, which is a whole nother era. But one thing that's great about what we're doing there is what we found is the tools that we're adding to the network are actually giving us an even higher level of visibility to the way that our students are interacting on the network, because the tools that we're adding allow us to dive in. I would love that.
Devices down. Yeah, that's great. I think that kind of goes to both sides, right? It also helps in educating the parents too. Some that aren't necessarily, I know Ellie said it as well as Julie said it. They're like, almost sometimes our kids know more about it than we do. I think we could kind of use based on Meadows' cores and values.
Yeah.
And what you guys are doing to protect our children, as well as provide the correct technology in class. I think that's something that we could help and work together on to provide information for parents to protect their children too. So we educate them. Hey,
absolutely. And I think I would just add that, we live in a society that prioritizes expertism, right?
Yeah.
So if I have a broken bone, my preference is to go to an expert to deal with the broken bone. And unfortunately, what that has put us in is a situation where as parents, we say, well, I'm not the expert in this. I don't know this. In fact, my 8-year-old knows more than this. Well, you know what you are, though? You're an expert in parenting. So don't put the cart before the horse. The device is not what matters. So yes, your daughter might know more about that device than you, but I guarantee you she doesn't know more about raising a good human being than you do. And so if you trust that part of the instinct and let that lead the way, and it does turn the model of expertism on its head. And that's okay, because like I said, the greatest resource we have in bridging that gap are those little experts in our home. They're the ones that can show us. That's why that question comes back to show me how you, show me what you, show me how you did this, show me how to do this. Those questions give our children the opportunity to show off to us, to show us their skills that they're developing, but also for us to get a glimpse into what their workflows are on these devices.
Thank you, Courtney. I think you wanted to add something there.
Please.
I'm always around to talk to. I have parents, but there are parents who just sometimes will say, can I just come in and talk to you because we got this new device and I want to make sure it's set up safely for my child.
Sure.
I can do that. But I'm hoping, and it's something I know that I've talked a little bit with Joe about, we definitely need some more parent communications and professional development. I'd love to be able to tell everybody a little bit more about what we do every day and how I tell the kids to be safe and what they're doing.
Yeah.
And along with the show me how to, show me how you, that is great just all the time for problem solving too, because in this world of instant gratification, our kids are used to just like, I'm struggling with this and you just do it for them. Talk them through it. And on that, still in line with that, that's where the modeling comes. I think this also goes on with what Mrs. Mace said. When you're doing stuff on your own device, so you've decided that you now want to download a new app on your own phone or your own iPad, like have your child with you, I say, and explain to them why you chose that. Explain to them what you're clicking yes to. Explain to them all those processes so that they understand that you also are accountable for those things and they know why they have to look at them. Otherwise, they just see mom and dad did this and downloaded and downloaded and downloaded, and they don't know there's anything special or unique or that they have to think about. So if we're modeling those steps, and after I approve this, oh no, now it's asking me if I want to link it to this. What do you think? And have a discussion about it. They're also seeing the thought process that goes behind all of that. And like I said, and that goes with the show me how to. So I'm going to show you how to do this. Like we're going to do this, download this together. I don't just push password and the cloud. That's
Right.
not enough.
And if I could,
recommended device management tools, maybe the ones that you
Yeah.
guys are using currently for different ecosystems. Obviously, I know you guys are using iPads, right? But there's other for Wintel
Yeah.
devices, Android devices too. Having that recommendation for parents, or being able to provide, let's say, a portal or a resource to say, hey, if you have an iPad and your children are using it, this could be a good tool for you to see what they're doing as well as educate them. I think that's super helpful. I mean, we get the
Right.
information from our friends, and thank goodness I know a lot of them, but there's still ways.
If I could just add one thing before I let you go, because your questions that you're asking, it just occurs to me that, the next conversation, which is with the slightly older students, parents, would probably be of value for a lot of you, because it will focus a bit more on creating an environment where our students understand their data and why that's something worth protecting. Because as you get a little bit older, you're generating more data. So that conversation will probably deal with some of those questions. And if you're available, or any of you are available, I would say, please come. I don't know off the top of my head when it is, but I'm sure the invitations went out. But we will talk a little bit more about creating a generation of students that consider their data a commodity and approach it from the standpoint of needing to protect it. And I think we'll dive a little bit more into those tools like data protection tools and BARC, those kinds of programs that are for managing that information. So I'd certainly invite you to, if you can join. I know I'm sure you're incredibly busy, but if you could join, it'd be great.
It's actually next Wednesday at 8:30. So I was just going to wrap this up and just say thank you to Joe. So happy to have your expertise and have you join the Meadows. And
Thank you.
Courtney, thank you for everything you do. And you guys are going to be a great team. We hope to do a lot more parent education next fall when we're in person, as we said. If you have friends who missed this talk, please ask them to come on Wednesday. And also, this was recorded, so it will be available for people as well. So thank you, everybody. Have a great long weekend. Thank you again, Joe and Courtney.
Thank you.
And have a great weekend.
Thank you.